Why do we? People often speak about oneness as if it's the final answer. Everything is one, everything is connected, everything is unified. Fair enough, but I rarely hear people talk about what oneness implies. Because if everything is truly one, then what is relationship between oneness and loneliness? Think about it. If there is only one, then there is no other, no outside, no second, no separation, which sounds beautiful until you follow the idea to its conclusion. Because what is absolute oneness if not absolute aloneness? Perhaps this is why people speak about oneness but struggle with loneliness. Not because the two are opposites, but because they may be pointing towards the same thing from different directions. One sounds enlightened, the other sounds devastating. Yet both may be describing the absence of an other, which raises a strange possibility. Is loneliness and suffering actually the same thing? I don't think so. Because suffering feels, loneliness doesn't. A feeling requires something to experience it, something to translate it, something to embody it. A frequency can exist without being interpreted. A language can exist without being understood. A signal can exist without ever being received. So perhaps loneliness is not suffering. Perhaps suffering is what occurs when consciousness encounters loneliness. The translator pays a price. The interpreter pays a price. The moment consciousness becomes aware of something vast enough to exceed this understanding, experience begins. And the experience has weight. Maybe loneliness itself is neutral, neutral in its emptiness. Yet the human experience of loneliness is anything but neutral. Not because loneliness changed, but because consciousness touched it. And people often say philosophers suffer because nobody understands them. Perhaps because philosophers have a habit of moving toward questions most people move away from. They don't merely ask what happiness is, they ask what suffering is. They don't merely ask what connection is, they ask what loneliness is. And the deeper they go, the stranger things become. Because eventually loneliness stopped looking like an emotion. It stopped looking like a psychological state. It starts looking like something fundamental, something woven into existence itself. The philosopher then finds himself carrying two perception or two perceptives at once. The neutrality of what is and the emotional reality of being human. They glimpse something that appears neutral in totality, yet devastating in experience. Not because philosophers know more, but because they keep holding both frequency at the same time. And if that's true, then this isn't merely a philosophical discussion for me. It's something that I carry quietly. And here's the thing, If loneliness is fundamental, then perhaps our distractions begin to make sense. Maybe we aren't escaping loneliness itself. Maybe we're escaping what loneliness reveals: relationships, entertainment, ambition, identity, meaning. And none of these are necessarily bad. But have you ever noticed how quickly we reach for something in the moment when silence appears? The moment stillness appears. The moment we are left alone with ourselves. The moment being alone becomes too quiet. It's almost as if consciousness instinctively searches for another, something to stand opposite to itself, something to relate to, almost, or something to define itself against for understanding. Because if consciousness ever stopped running long enough, it might discover something unsettling. That loneliness was never waiting at the end of the road, it was standing at the beginning. Maybe that's why we run from loneliness. Not because loneliness is suffering, but because consciousness transforms it into suffering. The interpreter feels what the frequency itself does not. The translator carries what the message itself does not. And perhaps that's the burden of awareness: to encounter something that appears simple from a distance, yet becomes immeasurable the closer you get to it. After all, people say they're alone but not lonely. They say all they need is themselves or nature. Yet, what exactly is nature? And why do we assume nature exists outside of the same mystery we're trying to understand? Perhaps loneliness is not the opposite of oneness. Perhaps loneliness is one of the implications of it. And one is often called the loneliest number. Yet paradoxically, one is also infinite.